At 9:02 on the last night of her life, Suzanne Joven sat down at her computer and typed an email about a person she didn't name. She called this person only, quote, someone, and didn't go much further than that. Someone had borrowed a set of test prep books from her, and she was going to get them back that evening. 53 minutes later, a caller dialed 911 to report a young woman bleeding at a quiet intersection nearly 2 miles away. 27 years later, investigators still can't tell you who that someone was, and they still can't tell you who was waiting for Suzanne Joven in the dark on Edge Hill Road. Suzanne was born on January 26, 1977, in Göttingen, Germany, a famous university town with centuries of innovation to its name. Her parents, Thomas and Donna, were American scientists who'd been recruited to the Max Planck Institute for Biophysical Chemistry. Suzanne grew up in Germany, and by the time she arrived in New Haven, she reportedly spoke several languages. At Yale, she double majored in political science and international studies, and she filled the hours around her coursework with an implausible amount of activity. She tutored elementary school kids in New Haven on a variety of subjects. She sang in the freshman chorus and performed with the Bach Society Orchestra. She co-founded the German Club, worked 3 years in the Davenport College Dining Hall, and ran the New Haven chapter of Best Buddies. This is a program that pairs student volunteers with adults who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. She was 21, a senior just months from graduation, with graduate school on the horizon, a boyfriend she'd been with since freshman year, and a future that looked wide open. On the afternoon of Friday, December 4th, 1998, she dropped off the next to last draft of her senior thesis. Its subject would sound eerie only in hindsight. The paper examined Osama bin Laden and the threat he posed to American security. Just for some context here, it was written nearly 3 years before the September 11th attacks made him a household name. That detail would later fuel some of the wilder theories about her case. But it's important to remember that bin Laden was already a well-known figure at the time in certain circles. On the day she handed it in, though, it was just a term paper, and she had a party to run. That evening, Joven hosted a pizza-making party for her Best Buddies chapter at Trinity Lutheran Church on Orange Street. She stayed late to help clean up, and by 8:30 she was driving another volunteer home in a borrowed station wagon. Around 8:45 p.m., she returned the car to a university lot at Edgewood Avenue and Howe Street and walked the 2 blocks back to her second-floor apartment at 258 Park Street. In one of the case's small ironies, her building sat directly above a Yale police substation. Just before 8:50, friends passing beneath her window called up and asked if she wanted to join them at the movies. She said that she would love to, but unfortunately she had schoolwork to do. At 9:02, she logged into her Yale email account and wrote that final message, in German, to a female friend. The subject was some books for a graduate school entrance exam, and the books, Joven explained, had already been loaned out. She said, though, that she'd retrieve them from someone that night and leave them in her building's lobby for her friend to pick up. She even included the access code to her door so the female friend could collect them whenever she wanted, and at 9:10 she logged off. If she made or received any phone calls after that, no one knows. Yale had an internal telephone system at the time, but the only issue with it was that calls within that internal telephone system couldn't be traced or logged in any way. Then she headed out on foot toward Phelps Gate on Yale's old campus, carrying the keys to the borrowed station wagon. The borrowed vehicle belonged to the university, which was why she was heading to that location. Around 9:22, on her way, she ran into a classmate named Peter Stein, who was out for a walk. They chatted for 2 or 3 minutes, and he later told police she seemed normal, walking at an unhurried pace, carrying nothing but a sheet or 2 of paper in her right hand. And you're going to want to recall what she was carrying, or rather what she wasn't carrying, because it'll be important in a moment. She mentioned no other plans for the night, though he couldn't recall the full details of the conversation. He did remember that she said she was exhausted and looking forward to a long night's sleep after finishing up a bit of work. She's presumed to have dropped the keys at Phelps Gate around 9:25, since she ran into Peter very close to her destination. Between 9:25 and 9:30, another student returning from a hockey game spotted her walking north on College Street, along the edge of the New Haven Green. Whether she was headed somewhere, waiting for a ride, or simply pausing to look at the Christmas lights strung across the campus, nobody has ever been able to say. That sighting is the last confirmed moment of Suzanne Joven's life, and it gives us an even more narrow window in which what unfolded had to happen. At 9:55 p.m., a 911 caller reported a woman bleeding at the corner of Edge Hill Road and East Rock Road in one of the most affluent residential neighborhoods in New Haven. New Haven has a bit of a seedy reputation, but East Rock is the kind of place where Yale faculty buy their houses and people walk their dogs after dark without a second thought. When officers arrived at 9:58, they found Joven lying face down on the grassy strip between the sidewalk and the street, her feet on the road. She'd been stabbed 17 times in the back of her head and neck, and her throat had been cut. She was rushed to Yale New Haven Hospital, where she was pronounced dead within the half hour. The scene told investigators several things at once. This wasn't a robbery, and it wasn't something even more sinister. She was fully clothed, still wearing her watch and earrings, and she had crumpled up cash in her pocket. Cops initially believed that her wallet may have been taken, but it was later found untouched in her room, completely dispelling the robbery angle. The ferocity of the attack, concentrated on the head and neck, suggested to many observers something personal, a rage that a stranger rarely brings to a random encounter. According to a network news broadcast that aired in 2000, the medical examiner determined that only one of the 17 wounds was fatal. The weapon was a 4 to 5 inch non-serrated flimsy knife, a rather unusual weapon for someone to use if they went out planning to attack someone. The knife was of such poor quality, and the ferocity of the attack was so great that the tip of the blade broke off during the attack. Then there's the geography problem, the detail that has haunted this case from the first night. The intersection where Joven was found sits 2 miles from where she was last seen. The window between the College Street sighting and the 911 call was roughly 25 to 30 minutes. Walking that distance in that time, at night, in the soft hiking boots she was wearing, is close to impossible, and no witness ever reported seeing her on the streets in between. The inescapable inference is that she got into a vehicle, either willingly or otherwise, and if she got in willingly, she likely knew her attacker. That single deduction has shaped every serious theory about the case since. The crime scene itself would leave behind a remarkable amount of unconventional physical evidence. Start with the soda bottle. In the bushes near where Joven fell, police recovered a plastic bottle of Fresca bearing her fingerprints and a partial palm print belonging to someone else. That print has never been identified, and the bottle raised its own puzzle, because Peter Stein was clear that Joven carried no bottle when he spoke with her at 9:22. Reporters later worked out that the only store near campus selling Fresca at that hour was Krauser's Market on York Street. It was 1 block from her apartment, and the store kept a security camera running at all times, so it's possible that the camera caught a relevant snippet of evidence. Unfortunately, by the time this became public in 2001, the police admitted they had never asked to see the tape, nor publicly sought out anyone who'd been in the store that night. Given that security video was on physical tapes back then, if any evidence existed, it had long since been destroyed. Then there's the van. Witnesses described a tan or brown van stopped in the roadway immediately beside the spot where Jovan was found, facing east. Faculty members reported that police were asking about a van within days of the crime, yet the department didn't disclose its existence to the public until March 2001. That November, a local paper reported that investigators had impounded a brown van in connection with the case. No link was ever confirmed, and no explanation for the long silence was ever offered. This has obviously infuriated many who have looked at the case, since identifying who was driving that van in the immediate aftermath could have broken the case immediately. And then there's the running man, yet another weird happening that took place around the scene of the crime. Days after the attack, a female motorist told police that around 10 p.m. on the night of the attack, she had seen something unusual. Near Whitney Avenue and Huntington Street, a few blocks from the scene, she'd seen a white man in his 20s or 30s sprinting past her car. He was an athletic figure in dark pants and a loose greenish jacket, running flat out away from the direction of the crime scene before disappearing onto the property of a church. Detectives showed her a photograph of exactly one man, the suspect they already favored, and even drove her in an unmarked van to look at him in person. She told them he wasn't the runner, and they never contacted her again, and her account stayed buried for nearly a decade until a new task force revealed it in 2008. It was only at that time they began posting a sketch of the runner around the neighborhood, 10 years after the crime had occurred, in a town with a transient student population. Now I'll come back to this suspect in a moment, but this is one of those fairly rare cases where the prosecutor eventually came out and flat out said that the suspect is innocent. That's not a common thing to do. Usually the language is much more conservative than that, but here I have a feeling you'll see why they declared him innocent. Finally, there's the DNA. Scrapings from under the fingernails of Jovan's left hand yielded a male genetic profile. This was first disclosed in late 2001 after police asked her friends and colleagues to volunteer samples. For 8 years, that profile was the great hope of the investigation, checked against numerous men who'd known her. In September 2009, her parents wrote to Connecticut's governor to complain that the state forensic laboratory was failing their daughter. The governor's office admitted the lab was sitting on a backlog of 12,000 untested genetic samples. 2 months later, the truth about the profile came out. The genetic evidence matched a forensic technician at the state police forensic laboratory. It was contamination. The most promising lead in the case had been an artifact of sloppy evidence handling all along. 4 days after the crime, someone leaked a name to the press, and for reasons that will become obvious, I'm not going to name him here. He was a Yale political science lecturer, former naval intelligence officer, and Jovan's thesis advisor. In January 1999, Yale announced that police had placed him in a pool of suspects. He was the only person ever publicly named, and the announcement detonated his life and effectively ground the investigation to a halt. Yale canceled his spring classes, reasoning that his presence in a lecture hall would be a distraction, and the cancellation read to the world like a verdict. Here's what the police actually had on him. Nothing physical whatsoever, just a hunch. A department sergeant admitted as much to a reporter 15 months later, conceding there was no evidence whatsoever tying him to the crime. Investigators had apparently become convinced that advisor and student were entangled in some unrequited or hidden romance, a theory her friends and her boyfriend found absurd. Neither the fingernail genetic evidence, back when it was still believed genuine, nor the palm print on the Fresca bottle matched him. The motorist, who I mentioned earlier, who'd watched the running man up close, told detectives he wasn't the man she saw, which was a major problem for this theory. When she told them he absolutely wasn't the person that she had seen fleeing the scene, They simply discarded her evidence and never contacted her again. Police reportedly went as far as contacting the Navy, his employer at the time, to urge a second look at his contract work. That review ended with him keeping both his job and his security clearance, because there was literally no evidence whatsoever against him. Because of this completely unfounded hunch, he was dismissed from a graduate program. Of course, since the cops were convinced he was their guy for no reason whatsoever, it appears they largely stopped investigating other possibilities. Under pressure from the Joven family, in December 2000, Yale hired two heavyweight private investigators to step up to the plate. These investigators were shocked at how the New Haven police focused in on this one man who rightfully had no reason whatsoever to be a suspect. In 2013, the state's attorney publicly confirmed, for the first time, that Suzanne's thesis advisor wasn't a suspect and never should have been. So yeah, unfortunately his name is still out there, linked to this horrific crime, and perhaps worse yet, this led to Suzanne's case being seriously neglected. This brings the narrative back to that final email I started this segment with. Joven told her friend she'd retrieved the graduate school test study books from someone that evening. The books were never returned, and no one has ever come forward as the borrower, despite saturation news coverage for decades. Investigators have long noted the oddity of her word choice, and believe that it's a clue to the identity of the borrower. In a message to a close friend, written in the casual shorthand of a Friday night, she referred to the borrower not by name, but by that vague pronoun. According to investigators, this may suggest it was someone she didn't know very well. If Joven went to meet that person between 9:30 and 9:55, then the borrower is either her attacker or the last witness who could explain what happened. Either way, their silence has lasted almost 3 decades, and given the situation, it's hard to think of an innocent explanation as to why they haven't come forward. The case was formally declared cold in September 2006 and handed to the state's cold case unit. In 2012, area residents brought the task force a tip about a former Yale graduate student who told friends he expected to be arrested for the crime. The man later ended himself, but for reasons that remain unclear, the cold case unit on the case appears to think this man is unrelated to the case. In 2018, Yale's former lead private investigator finally said publicly what many had long believed. The investigation was completely botched. By broadcasting for years that they already knew who did it, police taught every potential witness that their information didn't matter. The problem, of course, was that they accused an innocent man of the crime, so all those small threads of evidence that may have come in never did. Anyway, to me, this is a case that the more I researched it, the more it started to feel almost painfully obvious who did it. Suzanne said she was going to retrieve the test prep books from someone that night, and those books never came back. The borrower never came forward, and within less than an hour, Suzanne was dead, 2 miles away from campus, in a place she almost certainly didn't walk to on her own. So whoever had those books wasn't some tiny side detail. They were either the perp or the last person who could explain how Suzanne ended up in that car, on that road, at that exact time. After decades of publicity, the idea that this person innocently forgot, or somehow never realized they were central to the case, just feels impossible to believe. In a case full of weird distractions, the books remain the cleanest line back to whoever Suzanne trusted enough to meet that night. Unfortunately, though, this is a case where the detectives thought they had their man and botched the investigation through that unwarranted focus on an innocent party. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with my usual quick reminder to ring the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to check out the membership or the Patreon if you want to take your support for my channel to the next level. Your support helps me keep the channel going, and I really couldn't do it without you guys. So just a huge thanks to everyone who supports directly. For 4 years, a phone rang in a quiet Anaheim house, almost always on a Wednesday afternoon, almost always when the woman of the house was home alone. The man on the other end never gave a name, but it was very clear why he was calling. Some weeks he claimed Dorothy was alive and with him, and other weeks he said she was long gone, and that he was the one who'd done it. Then the line would go dead, always a few seconds too soon for a trace. Once, a man telling the same story phoned a newspaper instead, and he knew things that had never made it into print, details only a handful of people could have supplied. Till this day, despite all the evidence, the case of what happened to Dorothy remains an unsolved mystery. Dorothy Scott was born on April 23, 1948, and by the spring of 1980 she was 32 years old, living in Stanton, California, about 25 miles southeast of Los Angeles. She shared a home with her aunt and her young son, Sean. Her parents, Jacob and Vera Scott, lived in nearby Anaheim and looked after the boy while she worked. There's a small irony in where she worked. Dorothy was the back office secretary for two jointly owned Anaheim shops that sold psychedelic novelties, bongs, and counterculture merchandise. Dorothy herself couldn't have been further from the clientele that was served by this shop. She was a devout Christian who had never drank or experimented with drugs, and all reports seemed to indicate she was quite conservative in her day-to-day life. Not in the political sense, but in her approach to things like illicit substances and the like. Her father told the Los Angeles Times in June 1980 that she may have gone on the occasional date, but as far as the family knew, there was no steady boyfriend. There was no jealous ex-boyfriend lurking in the background, and no obvious candidate for what was about to happen to her. Several months before she vanished, Dorothy started getting calls at work from a man who wouldn't identify himself. The calls followed a pattern that anyone who's studied stalking cases will recognize immediately. Some days the caller professed his love for her, telling her she was beautiful and that he wanted to be with her. Other days he told her, in flat and specific terms, that he intended to end her life and that no one would ever find her. The threats alone would have been bad enough, but what truly frightened Dorothy was how much the man knew. The caller reportedly described what she was wearing on a given day and where she'd been, indicating that this stalking went far beyond telephone calls. On one occasion, he told her to step outside because he'd left her a gift. Terrified, she saw, sitting on the windshield of her car, a single red rose, and it was dead. Dorothy confided in her mother about the calls, which is largely why we know what the man said at all. She told her the voice sounded vaguely familiar, but she could never place it. She began thinking seriously about buying a weapon, and about a week before her disappearance, she enrolled in self-defense classes. On the evening of May 28, 1980, Dorothy attended a 9 o'clock employee meeting at the shop. During the meeting, she noticed that a co-worker, Conrad Bostron, looked unwell, with an angry red mark on his arm. Dorothy and another co-worker, Pam, decided to drive him to the emergency room at UC Irvine Medical Center in the city of Orange. On the way, Dorothy made a brief stop at her parents' house in Anaheim to check on Sean. While she was there, she swapped the black scarf she'd been wearing for a red one. It was a trivial detail, but hold on to it because it becomes one of the most important facts in this entire case. At the hospital, doctors determined that Bostron had been bitten by a black widow spider, and he was treated and discharged around 11 p.m. with a prescription to fill. Pam later told investigators that during the entire wait, Dorothy never left her side, never wandered off, and never made a phone call. Since Bostron was still feeling shaky, Dorothy offered to bring her car around to the exit so he wouldn't have to cross the parking lot. She ducked into the restroom briefly, then headed out alone to get her white 1973 Toyota station wagon. Pam and Bostrom filled the prescription and waited for her at the exit, though they noted that she was taking longer than expected. A few minutes passed, and then the Toyota appeared, moving fast. The headlights were aimed straight at them, bright enough that neither of them could see who was behind the wheel. They waved their arms to flag it down, but the car accelerated past them, took a hard right out of the lot, and disappeared. Both of them assumed Dorothy had likely forgotten something urgent she needed to do for her son, so they didn't immediately report her missing. However, as the hours passed with no word from her, and given the strange circumstances, they decided to call it in to the cops. At around 4:30 in the morning on May 29th, Dorothy's station wagon was found in an alley in Santa Ana, roughly 10 miles from the hospital, and it was on fire. According to later accounts of the investigation, the blaze appeared to have been set deliberately, with an accelerant on the passenger side. Whatever physical evidence that car might have held, whatever fingerprints or fibers or traces of a struggle, the fire took all of it. There was no sign of Dorothy anywhere nearby, and searches in the days that followed turned up nothing. Her parents put up a reward for information about their daughter, but it went unclaimed. On June 12, 1980, the Orange County Register ran a story about the disappearance, and that same day, a man called the paper's front desk. Speaking with an editor, he claimed responsibility for Dorothy's death, and he gave an elaborate backstory. He said she'd been his love, that he'd caught her being unfaithful with another man, and that she'd denied it. He also claimed that Dorothy had phoned him from the hospital that night. The editor relayed all of it to the police, and two details in that call changed the complexion of the case. The caller knew that Bostrom had been treated for a black widow spider bite, something that no one else would have known. Disturbingly, he also knew that Dorothy had switched scarves before arriving at the hospital. Only someone who'd seen Dorothy that night, or spoken to someone who had, could have known about the scarf or the bite. Investigators quickly came to believe the caller was the man responsible, but his story had a problem. Pam was adamant that Dorothy never made a phone call from the hospital, because the two women had been together the entire time. So either the caller invented that detail to explain how he knew where Dorothy was, or something stranger was going on. If he didn't get a phone call, how did he know she'd be at UC Irvine Medical Center on a night she had no reason to be there? Dorothy's trip to the emergency room was decided on the spur of the moment, prompted by a spider bite nobody could have predicted. In my view, the most unsettling reading is the simplest one. He knew because he followed her there. About a week after the disappearance, the phone rang at Jacob and Vera Scott's house. A man told them he had their daughter, then hung up, and it was the beginning of a routine that would last 4 years. The man called almost every Wednesday afternoon, nearly always when Vera was home alone, which itself suggests he knew the household's rhythms. He only ever talked to Vera, with one exception, which I'll get to in a moment. Sometimes he said Dorothy was with him, and sometimes he said he'd ended her life. The calls were always short, and that brevity was the name of the whole game, since tracing a call in 1980 wasn't the instant business it is today. The phone company needed the caller to stay connected while technicians worked, and this man behaved like someone who understood that. He delivered his line as quickly as he could and hung up within seconds. Police installed a recorder on the Scott's line, but recording a voice and attaching a name to it are two very different problems. In April 1984, the stalker called in the evening for the first time, and this time Jacob answered instead of Vera. The harassment stopped cold after that brief conversation with Jacob, suggesting that perhaps the stalker felt he lost control by mistiming the call. On August 6, 1984, construction workers made a discovery about 30 feet off Santa Ana Canyon Road in Anaheim Hills. Human bones lying beside the bones of a dog. The remains were partly charred, and investigators concluded they'd been there for at least 2 years, since a brush fire had swept across that exact spot in 1982. Among the bones were a turquoise ring and a wristwatch. Vera Scott said the watch had stopped at 12:30 a.m. on May 29, 1980, about an hour after Pam and Conrad watched that station wagon blow past them. On August 14th, dental records confirmed what the family had feared for 4 years. The remains were Dorothy's. The condition of the bones made it impossible for the coroner to determine how she died, which meant the discovery answered one question and closed off nearly every other. No one has ever publicly explained the dog she was found with, though given that the case is still open, I suspect we're being intentionally kept in the dark on that element. According to an Orange County Register report from August 20th, 1984, after news of the identification broke, the Scotts received another call. The caller was back on the line after months of silence, asking whether Dorothy was home, taunting the family. Detectives worked through the people in the orbit of Dorothy's life, her co-workers and the men who'd shown an interest in her. One man who'd reportedly spoken of wanting to marry Dorothy drew attention from investigators, but no charges ever came. He has since passed away without ever being publicly tied to the calls or anything else related to the case. Everything about the calls pointed toward someone who knew her, rather than a stranger. Dorothy found his voice to be vaguely familiar, which indicates that the two of them were likely acquainted at some point. Unfortunately, here we have a situation where the car fire destroyed the physical evidence, and the remains themselves gave up no cause of death. More than 4 decades later, the Orange County Sheriff's Department still lists Dorothy's case among its open cold cases, waiting for the one clue that could solve this mystery.